All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our webinar series, Legal Planning for Specialty Crop Producers. My name is Jackie Schweichler, and I have a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded. All registrants will receive access to this recording and recordings of the other presentations in our series. Check the bottom of the reminder email that you received from Zoom to find the link of the first recording. You'll receive another email with a link to this recording once it's available. If you have any questions during this presentation, please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll save some time at the end to go through those. To get a copy of this PowerPoint, check out the event page on our website. It's not posted right now, but it'll be posted before the end of the presentation or shortly thereafter. As we're getting started, I'd also like to provide a little background on the Penn State's Center for Agricultural and Shale Law. So we have Ross Pfeiffer, who is our center director. Chloe Marie is our research specialist. And in a couple minutes, you're going to meet Brook Duer. Now, as you can see on this slide, we've got quite a few different written products on our website. If you need to learn more about a specific topic in agricultural law, check out our agricultural law virtual resource rooms. If you're more interested in seeing a timeline of how important topics have developed, you should see our agricultural law issue tracker. For more frequent updates, you can subscribe to the Agricultural Law Weekly Review. You'll receive a once-a-week email with all the most important updates in agricultural law. For those of you who don't have time to read a whole nother newsletter, you can subscribe to our Agricultural Law podcast. Our podcasts can be found on all the usual podcast streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and on our website. To get to our website, go to aglaw.psu.edu. That's aglaw.psu.edu. In addition to our other agricultural law resources, we also operate Pennsylvania's agricultural law or agricultural mediation program. This program provides mediation services to agricultural producers for a long list of issues. If you have a situation with USDA and you're having trouble getting through to get them, communicating with them, you can send me an email. If you have a neighbor who's threatened to sue and you don't really want to get involved in a lawsuit, send me an email. Most of us would prefer to avoid going to court whenever possible. Plus, the program is currently free, so it's a great opportunity to resolve a conflict without spending a lot of money at the same time. Here is my contact information. I'll post this in the chat as well at some point during the presentation. Over the next few slides, I've listed the 6 topics in this legal planning series. The first and second presentations have passed, but as I mentioned, as registrants, you'll have access to those recordings. If you have trouble finding the links to the recordings, just send me an email and I can forward those to you directly. Please mark your calendar for the next presentation, which will be held as part of Ag Progress Days in Rock Springs, Pennsylvania. You'll be able to see us in person, so come on down, grab a milkshake, and bring your legal questions. This event is going to be held on August 10th, 2022. So that's at Ag Progress Days on August 10th. The next 2 webinars in this series will be held in November on the 16th and 30th. The first one will be licensing and regulatory obligations in selling raw and processed specialty crop products. The November 30th presentation will be municipal law and zoning for agritourism with specialty crop processing and sales. At the end of the year, on December 14th, we'll discuss Pennsylvania's Ag Area Security Law, right to farm, acre, and clean and green. Our last presentation in this program will be held at the 2023 PASA Sustainable Agriculture Conference. I'm almost done. I'd like to throw out a quick thank you and note that this presentation was created as part of the Pennsylvania Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. And I want to note that near the end of this program, I'm going to post a link in the chat to our specialty crop producer survey. It's a very short survey and should only take a couple of minutes of your time. These surveys help us out a lot, so we really appreciate it if you're able to fill it out. Please note that these surveys are different for each webinar. So if you filled out the survey for the last webinar, please fill it out again for this webinar. And in a couple minutes, I'm also going to post a poll question asking about how you've heard about this webinar. This is different than the survey question. Please do both if you're able to. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn things over to Brooke and I'll post that whole question.
All right, thanks, Jackie. Okay, all right, everyone. Again, this is part of our specialty crop block grant series for specialty crop producers. And we're into topic 3. The first 2 topics kind of set a little groundwork and they sort of build off each other. When we first talked about legal liability issues relating to business invitees coming to the farm, and very timely in terms of dealing with agritourism and other type pick your own operations, any farm markets, anything where you have the public coming to your farm. And then we talked in the second topic about liabilities relating to the selling of specialty crop products, including processed products and value-added type products. So we sort of covered the first 2 fundamental building blocks in understanding how liabilities can crop up when you're engaged in different things to supplement your income. Now we're going to talk about sort of the basic concept, which is how do you organize your business and in what form in order to give you the best as we call it, as we're referring to it here, operational resilience and liability avoidance. So they all kind of are related to each other in some way, shape, or form here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and move into my slides. There's our topic. And our objective here will be to review the various forms of business entity structures that you could employ as a specialty crop producer and talk a little about the attributes, pros and cons of each of them, and the formality that has to be followed to maintain the financial and legal liability protections that you get from these, as well as other benefits that you get from them, which we'll talk about, tax benefits, et cetera, and operational benefits. Now, in terms of an overview, here's what we're going to cover in what order. We're going to first sort of analyze the question of why choose a business structure at all. And then we'll talk about the various factors that come into play in terms of what business structures help you do and what they accomplish for you. And then we'll talk about sort of the basics of 6 of the most common business entities that are used not only in agriculture, but everywhere in all forms of business. And so that's, and if you think of it this way, I'm going to talk about 7 factors to consider that impact the decision of what type of business entity to do business under. And then I'm going to talk about 6 of the most common entities. So it's a group of 7 points and a group of 6. And this little star at the bottom of this slide is just to remind everybody to seek your own legal counsel for your own factual situation. And one of the things that we do here at the Ag Law Center, of course, is we provide educational information generally with regard to topics in the law as it applies to agricultural operations. We're not giving you legal advice on your specific set of circumstances because that really does require an in-depth consultation. So this is really, and a lot of the things that we do is really preparation for making the best use of the time that you're going to spend with an attorney while the clock is running. So again, this is prep for making the best use of your attorney's time when it comes time to talk to an attorney or an accountant. Many of the things that we talk about here are within the purview of an accountant to accomplish for you in many instances. Okay, now, the 7 factors to think about that weigh into the choice of what type of entity to do business under are listed here: liability, taxes, ownership and management features, features of the structure in terms of who has authority to do what, and what are the formal prerequisites, so to speak, or the requirements for binding the business entity or making major decisions. We're going to talk a little bit about capitalization as one of the factors, which means not only contributions of money, but contributions in kind also, like tractors and other pieces of equipment, other types of in-kind contributions. We'll talk just a little bit about transfer and estate planning issues that are impacted by what type of business you choose or what type of business entity you choose. And there are lots of features that make it a lot easier to deal with some of those issues, depending on how you organize yourself. And we'll talk very briefly about government program payments, because that does also come into play. So these are kind of the 7 factors that go into deciding on what's the right business entity structure for you. Now, and again, just to be familiar, just to familiarize you and make sure that people are on the same page, when we're talking about a choice of business entity structures, we're talking about a corporation, and there's a C corporation, an S corporation. C corporation is the traditional corporation. S corporation is a little variation on that. We'll talk about sole proprietorships, partnerships, both general partnerships and limited partnerships, and we'll talk about LLCs, limited liability companies, which is the newer of all of those types of entities that I mentioned. And LLCs are obviously something that came about because people felt the need for something that was even more flexible or more responsive to modern commerce, let's say. And there are other entities, forms and structures, but those are the ones we're going to talk about today. The rest of them are much more rare, let's say, and very specialized. So, okay, factor number 1. This is fitting right in with our first 2 sessions in the series, which is liability issues. Forming a business entity to do business is a form of protection from personal liability. In other words, keeping your business as one thing and your personal finances as another thing. Now, there are ways to do business that don't create that protection, and we'll talk about that. And some people continue to do business in those ways, and it's perfectly appropriate for them, and it works. But this is certainly a key factor. And the liability we're talking about can be financial liability, meaning you owe money to somebody, a vendor or something of that nature, a contractual dispute of some kind, something that involves a loan that wasn't repaid that was made to the business. That's the financial liability end. We're also talking about more unusual situations like casualty losses, like personal injury type of circumstances or property damage type of circumstances. Whether it's somebody who gets hurt in some way on the farm, knock on wood, you hopefully have insurance, but excuse me, I do that regularly. Let me just go forward here. Sorry about that. Okay. Whether we're talking about somebody who gets hurt on the farm, and hopefully, again, you have insurance, but also property damage can be very large. Let's assume you might have, a manure pit and it's leaking. I used that example the last time. And you have, leaching that's going on onto a neighbor, or you have, some type of inadvertent pesticide spray from your property to a neighbor's orchard or grapes or something of that nature. You just never know how unusual property damage claims can come up. Of course, the one that I used to deal in this area a lot when I worked for insurance companies, you have the escaped cow case, which a vehicle comes along and hits. Let's hope no one's hurt, but then you have a damaged car. Or damaged fencing from the car that got run off the road. So you get other types of claims that just can come out of the blue there. And then just a note of caution, of course, forming a business entity is not a replacement for insurance. It's another way to protect your personal assets because many times, or I shouldn't say many times, sometimes insurance isn't enough to cover a claim, or more likely, perhaps there's some glitch in the insurance that you didn't have coverage for what you thought you did, which is something that we talked about last time with regard to foodborne illness type cases. Okay, number 2, taxes. This is obviously a big driver in the decision of how to do business, whether as a corporation or something else. There is basically the concept of, okay, is the entity that you have chosen to do business under, is it taxed in its own right? Or is there something that we call pass-through taxation, which is you choose to do business in a certain form, such as an LLC, but the LLC itself doesn't file a tax return. The taxation of any income that's earned from the business enterprise is only paid, or the taxes are paid, and the federal government only taxes the income when it passes through the LLC to the actual part owners of the LLC. And then also, it's important to keep abreast of tax law changes, because they can happen very quickly. When the big tax code revisions that went through during the last presidential administration, and I'm trying to remember exactly what the year was that 2017, in any event, that particular major tax bill changed all kinds of things. So if you had met with an attorney before that tax bill to talk about what business entity to do business under and what would be best for you, that bill changed everything. You would have had to have gone back to an attorney and said, well, wait a minute, is this still the right decision for me? Because major things changed in that tax bill. And so you can really, that's why it's so important to consult an accountant or an attorney, because these are not static, permanent things that might be mentioned with regard to, and again, the big picture issues I'm going to talk about are sort of static and don't change all that much, although they could, but little details can change a lot, and that can really change whether it's better to do business as one form or another. Okay, another factor to consider is just the basics of how is the ownership structure set up, and is it flexible or is it very rigid? And sometimes you might want flexibility to bring people in and out. You have relatives that you're maybe farming with, and but then maybe they exit, or you bring in another, or you have somebody else that you want to share a part of your business with, or a certain portion of a project that you're doing. And so you want to have flexibility many times, but then there's other times where you might want something that's a little more solid and rigid, like maybe when you're dealing with family members and you want something to be set in stone so that, let's say, next generations know that these are the ground rules and this is the portion that they are owning or that they are entitled to. And you don't want to be having these issues always on the table for further discussion. Or if you have a retiring member of the family, let's say, who is looking to get out, and you want to provide them something, but you want it to essentially be set in stone, and this is the way it's going to be. And then that way you might want a less flexible type of arrangement. So that's one of the bullet points I have here: limited partners versus general partners. But usually when you have a retiring person in the family, you might want to consider a limited partnership type of arrangement, because then they can be not involved in the day-to-day management as a limited partner, but yet entitled to some certain portion of income, more in a passive role. So there's various permutations like that. You can also have non-voting shareholders as an example versus a voting shareholder. And again, that can be maybe because the next generation or the last generation, maybe it's best that they don't have a voting role at a given time. LLCs are generally viewed as the most flexible as long as they have an appropriate operating agreement. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, another factor to consider of the 7 is the authority issue, which is who has the authority to bind the business and who doesn't, and how are internal decisions made, and what is the requirement? Do you have to have a vote of the board of directors, or is it simply a majority of the people that own an interest? Or does somebody want to have a more heavily weighted vote because they contributed the most capital or the most equipment or whatever it might be? So you have to sort of design in and understand the process that you are subject to in your business for internal decision making. And there are business formalities to follow in certain forms of business or certain entity forms that in terms of documenting internal decisions. Do you need a vote of the shareholders and then a record in the meeting, in the minutes of the corporation, that such and such was decided upon? Those kinds of things can impact the decision of which way you want to go with a business entity. I know this is a little bit preliminary, but I'm trying to give you the flavor, and then we'll get to the actual entities themselves. Another factor to consider, and these are also sort of a little bit of the history. What I'm telling you is these are a little bit of the history of how corporations, for example, came to be, because there was a day, even in the United States, when corporations were not a legal thing to do. And that, there was a feeling hundreds of years ago, or a couple hundred years ago, that a person should be personally standing behind everything that they do in business. And so a corporation was not a person, and it was not somebody that you wanted to deal with. We now tolerate corporations and understand what they do and the role that they serve, but that was not always the case. In any event, the other issue, or one of the other factors, is capitalization. How easy is it to bring in additional investors, additional assets into the business? In other words, somebody says, well, I can't contribute, $20,000 to get X off the ground, but I can, contribute this tractor. Or, or sometimes you work out some sweat equity type of relationships where somebody accumulates a business interest by working hours. And so you have things that you can do in the way that you form the business entity that allow the business to become capitalized and to bring in additional assets or additional people. Sometimes you want to have very specific provisions to talk about what isn't part of the business. In other words, a line that says, this is actually my tractor. This is not I am not donating this tractor to the business. This is my personal tractor. If the business wants to lease it from me for even $1, fine, or lease it for a more fair rental value, and then maybe you still keep it insured under a policy of your own, but the business pays you rent for it. And so you need to be very clear in these business entity setups exactly what assets are a part of the business and what are not. Also, incurring debt to capitalize your business at any time. There's this idea that before many of these business entities were common for small commerce to be conducted. There was a time when nobody who had a family-owned and operated business was going to be forming a corporation. That was unheard of. Even 100 years ago, perhaps. They're probably more like maybe about 50 years ago, let's just say. So then when you went to borrow any kind of money, all of your personal assets were always on the table for the bank to look at, assess, et cetera. Basically, your personal finances were at issue at all times in terms of your ability to borrow. And then when you were repaying debt, these business entities give you a little bit of a shield from that. They give you a chance to essentially compartmentalize more between your personal assets and your personal finances and the businesses. Another factor is, again, the transfer and estate planning issue. Sometimes the business entity structure can facilitate transfer of shares instead of individual assets. You're just dividing up cash, dividing up equipment, et cetera. When there's a transfer, it can simply be ownership units of the business, and that is equivalent to an interest in the cash, an interest in the tractor, or whatever it may be, in the equipment. Okay, some of these business entities, again, I mentioned it before, they provide protection for retiring generations who can then perhaps reap income, but don't have to be involved, or the current owners maybe don't want them involved. And it's best that, they just collect their check. And it makes it easier sometimes to gift things to a next generation, or to sell things even on, some type of periodic basis to a next generation, or just someone who's buying into the business as a successor. And one of the key things that you have to think about too is an unexpected death or disability of a member of a business can destroy a business if you don't have a methodology in place for the surviving, maybe it's a spouse or whatever family members might exist, to be bought out. In other words, if a person passes or needs to leave the business or is unable to participate any longer and needs to be cashed out, so to speak, you don't want to have to raise that kind of money all in one shot. And particularly if it's your majority investor, your majority equity holder in the business, you don't want to all of a sudden, by an unexpected disability or death, having to come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy them out immediately. You want to have some process whereby that can happen in a more systematic way, and that the business can generate the funds to do that over time, perhaps, rather than the individual remaining owners having to come up with this giant chunk of money. That's a big reason why you create business entities. And lastly, some government programs, and this is a lesser thing, really perhaps for most of our attendees here today, but certain government programs do have an impact on what you might want to choose to do, because they may have various requirements for how a particular legal entity gets paid, or how payments are made under that. And again, I'm more or less talking about USDA programs here. Like things like we just lived through, like CFAP and some of these other programs that are out there. They can have requirements for active engagement in farming, the AEF requirement for certain government programs, and that creates these issues with regard to limited partners maybe not being eligible for certain programs, because you have to have a certain degree of active engagement in the farming to be eligible. And then also you have these adjusted gross income, these AGI per person limits, or a per entity limit with regard to certain government programs. So again, I'm not going to get into great detail. Just be aware that if you are a participator in some of those programs, those can impact what you want to do in terms of a business structure. All right. Now we'll get on to sort of the second half of our discussion here, which is the attributes of the different types of business structures. There's no single correct business structure for everybody. Your factors to consider could be completely different than somebody else's. Now, do I need a business entity? Businesses have been run for years and years and years without any formal structure, and they can still be run that way. However, the business operators, one or more, whatever the business might consist of, their personal assets then will be at risk from the business's debts or liabilities, whether it's those paper debts I was talking about before, like a loan or some contract dispute or a debt, or liabilities like a property damage liability, or let's say you have your barn burns and it catches the neighbor's outbuildings on fire also. You have things of that nature that you want to make sure that you're protected from, that arise from the business. The other issue is that if you do business without a formal structure, you may be losing some very nice and well-designed, let's say, tax benefits. And also just the general concept of managing assets and capital investment in a business and the operational needs, even on a day-to-day basis, that needs structure when you have more than one person. It can get difficult, particularly 2 might be easy to manage. 3 starts to get a little harder, depending on your business. You can imagine these concepts of what used to go on in the 1800s, when, people like Henry Ford, wanted to run a business where he was a sole proprietor, and then all of a sudden he's bringing in, multi-million-dollar partners, and trying to manage those things. That's what gave rise to a lot of the sort of business structure law that we have today. Is when businesses in the age of industrialization grew to such a size, they needed mechanisms for governing this. This was no longer something you could do by a sole proprietorship or by more informal means, let's just say. Okay, here's the 6 business entities that we're going to talk about: sole proprietorships, general partnerships, limited liability companies or LLCs, limited partnerships, and then C corporations, which is a traditional corporation, and then an S corporation, which is an innovation off of standard corporation, and is much, that's actually an S corporation is where the limited liability company concept came from. So if you wanted to put these in the order of how new or old they may be, you'd probably take number 3 and put it down here at the bottom. In any event, okay, a sole proprietorship, that's easy to set up. It's easy to conduct and maintain. My father was a sole proprietor bookstore operator, and he also had a very interesting military surplus business. Operated it out of his, no, it wasn't even his checkbook. He operated out of his briefcase in his pocket. You know, his pants pocket was his, you know, that was it. And so you can do it. It is done every day. You know, basically nothing, there's no technical separation of any kind from between the owner and the business. You're all one and the same. You know, business assets and liabilities are owned by this operator, you know, and so they're responsible for all business related debts, and they own all business related assets, including all the cash. No corporate formalities, but you're held personally for all the business's liabilities. Some people can do that just fine. One of the things that arises when you're a sole proprietorship, however, is the spousal involvement, because anytime, let's say you're a farmer, the land comes into play, because if you have a piece of property that is owned between 2 spouses, and let's say theoretically on its face, it looks like only one of them works the farm, so to speak. Well, the spouse is contributing their half of the real estate to the partnership, or excuse me, to the sole proprietor's use. Doesn't the wife sort of de facto become a partner? Because they've contributed all that. And of course they're involved. They're hearing the day-to-day operations of the farm in a more, you know, in a very traditional circumstance that, you know, might have been more common many, many years ago, and common today. But I think, you know, most of the time there aren't really the uninvolved spouses that there maybe perhaps once were. Everybody's involved now. So that's probably more the reality, you know, which is that anytime you have a piece of property that is owned by 2 spouses, that is de facto going to be a partnership if you're farming on that property. I don't care if the one spouse doesn't work the farm. So there are questionable gray areas with regard to whether a sole proprietorship really exists, or whether it's a husband and wife or a spousal, partnership. And the whole reason that you have a piece of property in a 2 spouses' names is because it's allegedly to be protected from the liabilities of one or the other spouse. But, you know, everything may just get jumbled up and mixed together in one spousal partnership in many of these circumstances. So there's some downsides, you know, to the sole proprietorship in certain situations arising from spousal ownership of assets that are used in the business. Okay, so this shows you the tax treatment. I borrowed these little images from a University of Minnesota extension website, and because they were nice and they fit exactly what we need to show you. So proprietor just pays, you know, federal income tax in their own name. They file a tax return like everybody else in the world. They either do a Schedule F, you know, farming income, or they do a regular Schedule C, just, you know, standard income, wages, business income, and away you go. Okay, if you have anything else that's not that, not a single person filing a single tax return in their own name, then it's a partnership. General partnerships are the default and the legal mechanism that you are in fact doing business under, whether you have a written agreement or not, if it's a business between 2 people, period. And that includes, you know, spouses. So similar to a sole proprietorship, it's just 2 or more people together, or, you know, 3 or 4 or whatever. And it's easy to set up. Again, it's very similar to the sole proprietorship. There isn't a whole lot of formality involved here. It's nice. It's easy to manage a workload with partners. It's easy to bring in assets when you have partners, and there's more to go. There's more assets to go around. All the partners' personal liabilities, however, are subject to the business's, personal assets are subject to the business's liabilities. So it's just a sole proprietorship times however many people. So all of their personal assets become part of the asset picture that could be responsible for business debts. There's a potential for personal conflicts between partners, particularly when you're in that intimacy of two or three, or a very tight number of people, many times related. Personal issues can get in the way without something more, let's just say, more formal or more premeditated than a partnership. Now, a partnership agreement is optional. A written partnership agreement is essential, but it is in fact legally optional. But you absolutely want to have one to start to sort out how you're going to handle certain things. Otherwise, you're just going to have a real mess on your hands. And I just would never, ever, I don't want to give you advice, but I'll tell you that that's a big problem. A partnership that doesn't have some kind of partnership agreement, is destined for problems. So this shows you the tax picture. The partnership itself does not pay taxes on its income. While it does a return, its income is distributed out directly to the partners, and they're through these K1s, and which is the partnership distribution form, and then the only time it's taxed is in the personal income tax returns of the partners themselves. Okay, so now one of the things about a partnership that comes into play is that there's a self-employment tax that does apply, just like for sole proprietors, where the Social Security contribution and the Medicare contribution is taxed to each individual partner's, personal income tax return, or their income is taxed, for their self-employment tax portions at that juncture. And we'll get to that in a minute because there's some good features of other forms that don't do that. Okay, now limited liability companies. This is the newest and pretty much the most popular form for doing business these days. It's a separate legal entity, a little bit like a corporation in the sense that it has its own existence. It may have as few as one member. You can have a one-person limited liability company. The owner decides how to be treated for taxes. Just about everybody chooses to do it the way that the next bullet point says, which is it's most often treated as a pass-through, just like a partnership. And that's what this little picture shows you. That's pass-through taxation, meaning no taxation at the partnership side here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. No taxation at the entity, only federal income taxation at the individual owner's personal income taxes. That's pass-through taxation. Okay, that's what a limited liability company does also. So it gives you the best of that world, but plus it's a freestanding entity like a corporation where the personal assets of the owners are not available to satisfy business liabilities. So it's like the best of both worlds. It is technically optional to have an operating agreement for an LLC, but again, you don't want to be going out there without one. And that's where you basically spell everything out. And you can make it very easy for people to come in and go out by acquiring an ownership interest in the LLC. You're just called a member. You're not technically called a shareholder, sort of to keep it distinguished from corporations. You can set up very easy mechanisms in an operating agreement for people to come and go, and an evaluation mechanism for how much it takes to come and how much it takes to go or to be bought out. So that begins to create some order, very similar to a corporation, but much, much easier and much more like a partnership, really. And you get the partnership taxation, you get the pass-through taxation. So here's what an LLC looks like. No federal income tax at the business entity level, everybody gets the same kind of K1 that a partner does in a partnership. And then the partner's personal income tax returns is the first time the IRS gets a bite of it. Now, the earnings from an LLC do, in fact, you still have to pay the SE, the self-employment tax. In other words, you have, since the IRS hasn't received anything yet with regard to Social Security contributions or Medicare, that's where it comes out at the self-employment tax rate in the partner's personal tax return. Okay, now, limited partnerships are a derivation of a regular partnership, and the real difference is that you have same issue with regard to its two or more people. You have a general partner who oversees the business and is actively involved, and a general partner can even be another partnership, or you can have several general partners. I should have probably put S on there, general partners, excuse me, oversee the business. And then you have limited partners who do not partake in the management. Now, the setup essentially is that the general partner is just like a partner in any partnership. Their personal assets are at risk, but they get the tax benefit of the pass-through, but that's the general partner. But then the limited partners are basically, they aren't exposed to business liability. They get the protections, because they're really not involved in the day-to-day operations. They don't partake in the management, and their personal assets aren't at stake. It's a way for you to bring in a well-heeled, let's say, investor who might want to contribute and help and render or reap benefits, I should say, but yet doesn't want to be involved in, any issues that could bring personal liability if the business goes belly up, whatever. And so they're not interested in doing personal guarantees or, having to disclose all their personal financial statements to a bank who might be lending, but they are willing to contribute to the to the enterprise anyway. So that's what a limited partner kind of does. It creates this two categories of partners. One that's more like a shareholder investor who's not involved in day-to-day, and then the others who are. And it does get the pass-through taxation, so the IRS doesn't take two bites of the apple. Now, let's get to the C corporation. You pay income, the C corporation pays income tax on the profits earned by the business, and then the income that's generated by the business is distributed to the shareholders as dividends or salary paid to working owners. Sometimes it's also paid as rent if let's say that one of the working owners in a C corporation has an asset that they're going to lease to the corporation, then that may get paid back, or they may reap income from the corporation as simply rent for something that they contributed and leased to the corporation. And that income is all taxed at the owner's individual rate, as if it's income to them as an individual. But the corporation has already paid tax on profits. So this is the concept. So in other words, this is the concept of double taxation. The IRS theoretically gets two bites at the apple, from the corporation as corporate income, and then from the shareholders and working owners as their distributions from the corporation, whether it's paid by dividends or as salary. Either way, the IRS gets another bite at the apple. So that's the conundrum of double taxation with corporations. That's what led to the S corporation, and then the S corporation's formalities, kind of led to the limited liability company. We'll get to the S corporation in a second. Got a little ahead of you there. Okay, now there's potentially a lot more deductions available in a corporate setup. So depending on your individual circumstances, it can be beneficial to still farm as a C corporation, depending on what deductions you need to take. And that all depends on what commodity you're involved in or commodities you're involved in, as well as what government programs you may participate in. So there are issues there that you have to explore. Now, there's a lower or put it this way, to pay yourself let's say as a working owner, but as salary, the corporation is going to take care of the Social Security and Medicare contributions at a lower rate than the normal self-employment tax. So it's a little bit of a benefit to the individual, sort of working owners that might form a C corporation. Corporations, obviously, that this is the ironclad rule of corporations, that they protect the personal assets of all of the shareholders. The shareholders never have personal liability for business debts or business liabilities. But, corporation has got to have strict adherence to the idea of no commingling of the funds, got to follow all the corporate formalities. Corporations require very strict governance structures. You got to have shareholders, you have to have directors, a board of directors, you have to have corporate officers, and you have to keep the business sufficiently capitalized. And you really have to be serious about running a corporation, because that's what it is. And to get the benefits, that's what you got to do. And if you don't do that, at the bottom of this slide, here's what happens. This idea you may have heard called piercing the corporate veil. The idea is that if you created a C corporation, if you don't follow the formalities, there could be a loss of that protection from the personal liability for business debts. So, you may end up having a business that goes under, and you end up being personally liable because you were not following a C corporation that goes under, and you may end up being personally liable for business debts. And putting the C corporation in bankruptcy isn't going to do you any good. You may end up having to do a personal bankruptcy to get out from under it. So there are issues there if you don't follow the corporate formalities and you have a C corporation. Other things, you obviously have to have appoint your directors. The directors, it's best to have corporate bylaws, of course, which dictate things like what types of decisions are made at which level, what do the day-to-day management, and if the president of the corporation, what does the president have the authority to decide versus the board? You got to draft and file articles of incorporation with the state. You have to, again, draft, and you have to adhere to your bylaws. Don't just write them and throw them in a drawer and never pay attention to them. You got to hold an initial organizational meeting where you adopt the bylaws, you elect officers, you actually issue stock, and then you have to continue to hold annual meetings every year. You got to keep corporate minutes. Again, a shareholder agreement, is a very good thing to have in addition to your bylaws. And the shareholder agreement, would set forth things like, how do you buy somebody out, particularly if they pass away? How long do you have to buy out their interest? And many other things that you can include in a shareholder agreement. So those are all the kind of things you need to consult with an attorney about. So this is how a C corporation looks. The C corporation pays its own tax on its income, and it pays wages to possibly, these wages here may possibly go to the shareholders / working owners. It may pay rent. Again, that could go to some of these working owners or shareholders, and you distribute dividends, which could be, or will be to the shareholders who may in fact be working owners. And then, so the IRS takes a bite here, and then the IRS takes a bite here when the shareholders themselves file individual income tax returns. Okay, now let's talk about the S corporation. S corporation, like a corporation in many, many, many respects, it files a business tax return just like a corporation would. The profit and loss are, however, passed through to the owners and taxed at the individual tax rates, not the corporate tax rate. And so there's the benefit that you're getting out from under an old-fashioned double taxation situation with a corporation. Pass-through profits aren't subject to the self-employment tax again. Now, the thing about an S corporation is you can't be an owner of an S corporation and not take, or you can't be a shareholder of an S corporation and not take a salary. So everybody's required to take a salary, and you need to set up in your structure in your bylaws and your shareholder agreement exactly how that's going to be computed, because the IRS will impute to everyone a salary. And the reason is because of these pass-through, they have to get their bite of Medicare or Social Security through the self-employment tax. So you can't take everybody off the payroll and put them in as as shareholders only receiving dividends, because then the IRS is missing their bite. So that's the reason that exists. There's obviously just in general more rules and regulations than a partnership. And now the personal asset protection from business liabilities exists in an S corporation, just like it did in a C corporation, if all the corporate formalities are followed. Now, we did this a little bit out of order, but you can see an S corporation existed and came into being long before LLCs. With the advent of LLCs, many people would say, why would we ever do this? There still are reasons for doing it. Some of the issues about what deductions you can take that we talked about in corporations, with C corporations also apply here. There are reasons that it can work for some people. So again, talk to your lawyer, talk to your accountant. Here's a little chart that shows you the attributes of each one with regard to tax treatment. I won't go through that because we just went through it. I'm going to wrap up here. We'll go to Q&A. One of the things that I wanted to cover, though, before we sort of stop, because I know your head's probably swimming, is what's a required filing and what isn't with regard to these different business entities with the Pennsylvania authorities. And the agency in Pennsylvania that deals with the creation, maintenance, et cetera, and registration of business entities is the Department of State, and it's technically called the Corporation Bureau. And if this is a link, you get our PowerPoint, this is a link to their website. I just put up a handy key in the upper right-hand corner where it shows the kinds of entities here, so you can remember what we're talking about. The interesting thing is there's only 3 required filings in Pennsylvania for all of these business entities. It's required to file articles of incorporation for an S and a C corp. You can't really, they don't exist until you do that, because they exist by virtue or by, the authority of the state government to allow a corporation to exist is the only reason it is allowed to exist. So you must file articles of incorporation, otherwise the corporation doesn't exist. Not the same with a partnership. Those are entities that exist regardless of a state filing, let's just put it that way. And in a lot of ways is because they existed before, this state existed. Partnership, is a business entity that exists before the Constitution of the U.S. or any state that makes up the U.S. wrote a constitution. Are not the same with corporations. In any event, articles of incorporation for S and C required. Certificate of organization is the substitute document. Basically, it fills the same role for an LLC. Again, an LLC cannot exist, but for the granting of the right to exist by the state government. So the LLC is, again, has a required filing. For a limited partnership, there is a required filing because, again, that is another thing that doesn't exist, but for the authority or the granting of the right to do it from the state. And that there's a required certificate of limited partnership for a limited partnership. That's it. Those are the required governmental filings. Everything else can be done outside of the government's purview. There are 2 very important things, one less so perhaps, that also should be very seriously looked into with regard to forming your business. And the first is a registration of a fictitious name. So if you're going to, you're John and Mary Smith, but, you want to do business as, Green Acres, CSA, the Green Acres CSA is nothing but a name you made up to do business under. And let's say that John and Mary Smith are a partnership. So that's the partnership trading and doing business as Green Acres CSA. Green Acres CSA is therefore the fictitious name under which they have chosen to do business. So in order to protect your business's establishment of that name and your association with that name, it is best to file, although not required, a registration of the fictitious name. And that gives you, and again, it gets complicated in terms of exactly what rights that gives you to stop someone else from using that same name. It gives you a much better legal foot in the door to stop somebody from using that same name in your business. There are many, similar names out there. It's the old McDonald's thing. Somebody named McDonald's, can open a hamburger stand of their own. Theoretically, they can register that name, but they may very well, run into some big problems. Not because of any state law. It's mostly going to be because of concepts of intellectual property and the time and money they've spent building up the goodwill of the name McDonald's associated with hamburgers. But in any event, that's a discussion for another time. But the bottom line is, in order to protect your trade name, you should register your fictitious name. There's also a certificate of partnership authority for a general partnership. Sometimes you might want to file that if there's an issue with, you don't want junior partners being able to bind the business. This is sort of the definitive document to say whose signature can be on something that binds a general partnership. It's a lesser used document, but it does exist. Okay, Jackie, you can go ahead with the survey, and we will look for questions. While you're doing that, I'm going to read the questions over.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Brooke. All right, everyone. So on this slide, I have a QR code. So to use the QR code, all you need to do is you can hold up your cell phone with the camera on, and you just hold it up to the QR code, and it should post a hyperlink that you can click on. It'll take you right to the survey. The survey is only 10 questions. It should only take you a couple of minutes. And I've also got the link. The link has been posted in the chat. So please click on the link in the chat or use the QR code here. All right, Brooke, how are you doing on those questions? I think I might turn things back over to you then.
Two questions here, and please put some more in if you have them. If an S corporation has no profit, how can shareholders take a salary? Okay, is that a requirement? A state, federal, or both law? Never heard about it. Thanks. Okay, so you can set yourself up, to take a salary, and then, if the business, you should set it in place in your formation documents and your your shareholders agreement. However, if you are in fact showing a loss, then of course there will be no salary. So if there is no income, the federal government is not entitled to get a piece of zero. So you're probably correct in pointing out that the requirement for a salary is if you have corporate income. If in fact there is, or I should say corporate profit, after paying expenses, et cetera. So your question assumes that there wasn't any. So therefore, that's in that particular case, then correct. The salary could legally be zero. So that didn't want to confuse you there. That's a very good question though, because you're looking inside, the situation. So that's a good lesson for me to explain it a little better next time. Also, question: are there any additional filings to be legal, such as business license, et cetera, or are the filings discussed all that is needed? Good question. And one of our subsequent or one of our later topics, in fact, will be on that topic, or one of our later sessions, excuse me, in, let's see, November. Our first of the 3 fall sessions that we're going to do in this series is all about licensing and regulatory obligations in selling raw and processed, especially crop products. So what that's going to be about is getting the licenses from the state for the various types of businesses in which you might be engaged. So the big one, of course, first right out of the box is always a sales tax license, and everybody always forgets that. If you're selling anything other than completely unprocessed raw agricultural products, you're basically going to need a retail food facility license from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. If you have a place where food is stored in any way, shape, or form that isn't the retail food facility, you're going to need what's called a food establishment license. Those are the biggies. Then, of course, you might have some of these other things that come into play depending on what you're doing. Like if you're doing dairy, maybe, if you're making cheese, you got goats, depending on the circumstances, you may end up having, some other types of licenses involved. But that's kind of, sales tax and the retail food facility and the food establishment license are the big three, really, that I think would probably apply to most people here. I have a license for growing hemp and an LLC. Well, there you go. Yes, you would have the hemp license from the Bureau of Plant Industry, and then you're set up as an LLC, which is a good way to be. It probably works just nicely for that circumstance. So yeah, that's that in that particular case. Unless you're doing something additional with that hemp other than selling it at a wholesale rate to somebody, let's hope, keep our fingers crossed that there's a market someday for somebody to sell that to, then it doesn't sound like you're going to need anything else. Just my quick stab at that one. Okay, it being 1:03 p.m. Jackie, I think we can conclude. I really want to thank everybody for attending, and hope you learned something. And again, the PowerPoint will help you out a lot to sort of give you a refresher on all the things we talked about. It's not as complicated as it sounds. Now you at least know some of the things you need to be thinking about, and go to an attorney and accountant and start the ball rolling. To get yourself, again, better protected, and you hate to say it, but better protected from business failure, is one of the large liabilities that you want to be protected against. But all the other things that come up in a day-to-day operation of a successful business, you also do not want to be exposed to by forming and properly running a business entity. So thanks, everybody.